Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we celebrate that most Russian of all Russian composers, at least one of the top two, and that is Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Now, Rimsky-Korsakov was prolific, and his music was beloved in Russia during his lifetime, a very famous and respected figure. It was beloved in the world in his lifetime. It remains beloved even now, at least among those who listen to romantic orchestral music and opera. Now, why do I say he's one of the most, if not the most Russian of all of the Russian composers? Well, you could argue that Mikhail Glinka could fulfill this role, as he was the inventor of Russian classical music. Tchaikovsky, some might argue, but many more would argue against, because while Tchaikovsky certainly employed many Russian themes, he was an admirer more of Mozart and the pre-Mozartian Italian composers, more than he was an admirer of contemporary European music or contemporary Russian classical or Russian folk themes. Very famous and one of my favorite composers, but not the most Russian. You could argue that Mussorgsky was the most Russian, but the reason I would say that Rimsky-Korsakov is the ultimate is that not only did he compose prolific amounts of music, but he helped to orchestrate many of the compositions and compositional fragments left over by Mussorgsky, who liked a bit of a drink, because after all, who doesn't? But Rimsky-Korsakov had such a wonderful way of blending the raw, earthy, emotional Russian folkloric traditions with ultra contemporary for the time and quite ahead of its time even to this day classical music. A lot of the octatonics that we heard in 20th century composers were used in Rimsky-Korsakov's 19th century compositions. So he was very ahead of his time in many ways, and yet he was able to play with exotic harmonies, familiar harmonies, and irresistible melodies that are familiar even to people who don't know anything about this kind of music. Think Flight of the Bumblebee, think probably most prolifically his most famous work, the orchestral suite Scheherazade. Think about one of the finest overtures ever written and one of my favorite pieces, the Russian Easter Overture, which played on a lot of Orthodox Christian themes in terms of the Russian Orthodox Church and a lot of original, beautiful composition. May Night, another fantastic composition. His Capriccio Espagnol, very much where Russia meets Spain, musically speaking. And his operas, while performed more in Russia than outside, many of the symphonic suites taken from these operas are incredibly popular. Between Christmas Eve and the Terror of Tsar Sultan, I would say that those are some of the best operatic suites ever put together. The Golden Cockerel, sometimes translated to the Cock of Gold, is another great one. The Snow Maiden, the Dance of the Clowns from that opera has become very famous in its own right. Vidonia, another great opera. And he even, well, it's not played that much. He even wrote a symphony, even though he's known more for his suites and his operas than for his symphonic music. But just wonderful stuff. Sadko and Antar, two other great ones, very popular in Russia, less so outside of it. And we can thank him for helping Mussorgsky to orchestrate some of his most famous works. And I think that because of that, I put Rimsky-Korsakov on top in terms of that most Russian of all Russian composers. Now, Rimsky-Korsakov was part of a group called the Mighty Handful in Russia, but usually in outside of Russia, people call them the Five or the Great Five. Now, this was a group of mainly musicians and one author, Cesar Cui, who were very much interested in promoting Russian culture, Russian folklore, Russian national music and artwork into the classical music of the 19th century. And of these composers, Balai was considered the leader, and in this group were Mussorgsky himself, Borodin, and of course Rimsky-Korsakov. Now, of all of these composers, while Mussorgsky comes very close, I would say that at an international level, Rimsky's music is definitely the most famous. Rimsky-Korsakov's music is the most famous, and rightly so. I mean, some of the music he composed is just so unforgettable. He had a knack for great melody, for great harmony, and also really interesting use of things like, again, octatonic chords. Really, really interesting stuff. So check out Rimsky today. The conductors who I think did the best by him are Nikolai Golovonov. He did quite a lot of Rimsky-Korsakov recordings. All of his works were recorded as part of the Russian anthology series by one of the titans of Russian conducting, Yevgeny Sviatlonov. Another great Russian conductor, Kirill Kondrashin, did a lot of great work with Rimsky-Korsakov. And for the non-Russian conductors who did a great job with him, I would pick Stokowski. Leopold Stokowski did wonderful interpretations of his work. And then the Swiss conductor, Ernest Ansermet, who had a kind of affinity for a lot of Russian composers, and Rimsky-Korsakov was one of them. He recorded a lot of his music. Any of those conductors I just named, you can't go wrong. And if you didn't hear that, use the rewind button on YouTube. Don't know if that helps me with the algorithm jig, but you never know. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.